of maintaining international peace and security in the face of the stalemate at the Security Council over Gaza. The OIC group countries expect the full and early implementation of this General Assembly resolution. Notwithstanding the long delay, the adoption last Wednesday by the United Nations Security Council of a humanitarian resolution is notable. It is indeed an indication that all hopes are not lost in our efforts to save lives and prevent the pain and pangs of war on the civilian population and the vulnerable segment of the Palestinian population. The OIC member states expect immediate acceptance of the Security Council call for a sustained humanitarian pause. We will continue to demand that this is followed by a ceasefire, sustained humanitarian supplies to the besieged population of Gaza, and a halt to the Israel design and attempt to displace them. We also thank the various United Nations entities for this briefing today, which underscore the fact that the United Nations Secretary General and his colleague have continued to address the dire humanitarian situation facing the innocent civilian population on the Gaza Strip and other parts of occupied Palestinian territory. Since the emergency special session, the daily and indiscriminate bombardment of the houses and hospitals have continued with unprecedented and greater intensity. This has led to an increase in the number of casualties among the civilian population, including children and women. The grave humanitarian situation in Gaza also witnessed the forced displacement of more than 1.6 million Palestinian inhabitants and foreign residents under the desperate condition of lack of food, water, and medicine. We wish to also join the United Nations in mourning the death of over 100 aid workers from the United Nations Relief and Workers Agency, UNRWA. We state at this juncture that the only befitting tribute to the supreme sacrifice of these international workers is to proceed in a timely fashion with the implementation of the commitment made during the 10th Emergency Special Session. To this end, we call for the immediate cessation of hostility on the Gaza and elsewhere in the occupied territory in line with the resolution ES 10/21 of 27 October 2023. This includes the need for Israel, the occupying power, to respect its obligation under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Mr. President, the OIC leaders, during their joint Arab-Islamic Extraordinary Summit on Israel aggression against the Palestinian people held in Riyadh, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on 11 November 2023, reaffirmed that a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace remains the only strategic choice and pathway to the security and stability in the region. They therefore held the occupying power responsible for the continuation and aggravation of the conflicts as a result of its aggression against the rights of the Palestinian people and against the Islamic and Christian entities, as well as the perpetuation of occupation and the wanton violation of international law in the occupied Palestinian territory and Gaza Strip. Accordingly, OIC rejects the description of the ongoing aggression against defenseless civilians in Gaza as self-defense and condemns the brutal and human massacre committed by the Israeli occupation forces against Palestinians. Consequently, we urge the United Nations to take practical steps to break the siege on Gaza and facilitate the immediate and uninterrupted entry of international humanitarian aid convoys, including food, medicine, and fuel, into the Gaza Strip. Similarly, we call for the creation of a mechanism for the protection of the facilities and humanitarian installation and an interrupted movement of aid convoys. Mr. President, the significance of today's briefing by the various United institutions, sadly, with the role of providing relief and support for the unbelieved and long-suffering people of Gaza and Palestine, as indicated in the gory details of human rights suffering and deprivation among the children, women, and civil population of Gaza, is to spur us to action. The human conscience cannot but react positively to these atrocities being committed against the Palestinians. The international community, as represented by this August Assembly, should act decisively to stop the continuing massacre and the shedding of innocent blood occasioned by the ongoing Israeli aggression in Gaza and occupying Palestinian territory. Without doubt, this measure should be a prelude to the immediate implementation of excellent United Nations resolution and the launching of a serious and genuine peace process on the basis of two-state solution along the border of June 4, 1967, with East Jerusalem at its capital. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mauritania, and I now invite to take the floor the representative of Pakistan, speaking on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I am delivering this abridged version of a statement on behalf of Algeria, Bolivia, China, Cuba, Egypt, Eritrea, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Nicaragua, Nigeria, Russian Federation, Sri Lanka, Syria, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and my own delegation, Pakistan. The full text of this statement will be circulated. Mr. President, we thank you for convening this meeting, which has afforded an opportunity to the entire membership to hear firsthand from senior leadership in the UN agencies regarding the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. We thank all the briefers for their outstanding briefings and remarks. These are a poignant reminder of the scale and scope of the human tragedy of epic proportions that is unfolding in Gaza. Only in the last 40 days, more than 11,000 Palestinians, civilians, have lost their lives, 2/3 of them women and children. Another 27,000 have been injured. Around 2,700, including 1,500 children, have been reported missing or dead, or trapped under the rubble. In excess of 1.6 million Gazans have been displaced, and over 41,000 housing units destroyed. More than half of the hospitals in Gaza are non-functional. Essential supplies of food, fuel, and medicines are blockaded. Schools and places of worship are being targeted indiscriminately. Women, children, and the vulnerable population are bearing the brunt of the onslaught by the occupying power. Mr. President, we pay tribute to the 102 staff members of UNRWA who have perished in Gaza, the highest number of UN aid workers killed in a conflict in the history of the United Nations. While condemning all atrocities against the Palestinians, and in accordance with General Assembly resolution adopted on 27th October, we all call for, first, an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities. Two, immediate, continuous, sufficient, and unhindered provision of essential goods and services to civilians throughout the Gaza Strip, stressing the imperative under international humanitarian law of ensuring that civilians are not deprived of objects indispensable to their survival. 3, the establishment of humanitarian corridors and other initiatives to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance. And 4, the need to urgently establish a mechanism to ensure the protection of the Palestinian people, the Palestinian population, in accordance with international law and relevant UN resolutions. We firmly reject and condemn attempts at the forced displacement of Palestinian civilian population and the illegal evacuation and relocations inside Gaza, and consider this a grave violation of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, the obligations under international law, particularly in regard to the protection of civilians and civilian objects, as well as protection of humanitarian personnel, must be fully adhered to. We call on the international community not only to promptly address the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, compelling Israel to cease its occupation and hostilities, put an end to atrocities, guarantee unimpeded access to humanitarian aid, and accelerate the prompt delivery of vital supplies. But we also call to ensure that those responsible are held accountable for their criminal acts against the Palestinian people. In this regard, we recall the decision issued by the Emergency Arab Islamic Summit held in Riyadh on November 11, 2023. Mr. President, the people of Gaza are desperately looking up to the United Nations to save them from further death and destruction, which is being wreaked upon them with impunity by Israel. We call for the full implementation of the resolution adopted at the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly on 27th October. And we note the adoption of Resolution 2712 by the Security Council on 15 November and hope that the Council will adopt a more substantive resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire. Mr. President, we consider it necessary to intensify international efforts in the search for a durable and peaceful solution. Therefore, we reiterate the demand to advance the peace process in accordance with the resolutions of the Security Council, the United Nations, and the Arab Peace Initiative, aimed at finding a just and comprehensive solution and establishing an independent Palestinian state in accordance with the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the delegation of Pakistan for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations.
Mr. President, Venezuela has the honor to take the floor on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations. And in the interest of time, I will provide a summary of my statement. Firstly, we welcome the holding of this important informal meeting, as well as the valuable briefings we've received today. They bear witness to a humanitarian catastrophe which continues to deteriorate day by day, minute by minute. Mr. President, we are about to enter the 6th week into this regrettable spiral of violence, death, and destruction that has caused the deaths of thousands and thousands of innocent civilians in the Gaza Strip and beyond, in particular women and children, as well as over 100 heroes from the UN Relief and Works Agency in the Near East who were killed while fulfilling their humanitarian mandate of providing assistance and protection to millions of Palestinian refugees. It has been almost 6 intense and painful weeks during which the entire Gaza Strip, north and south, east and west, has been besieged and indiscriminately bombed and shelled by the Israeli military forces. No space or civilian infrastructure is safe from airstrikes. Refugee camps have been raided. Schools and hospitals have not been spared. Today, they are still under attack. The evidence is before our very eyes. It is in the media, and it is public record. The international humanitarian law has been completely trampled. We call for international law to be respected, in particular the principles of proportionality and distinction, as well as the safety and security of all civilians, particularly children, and of all humanitarian and medical personnel on the ground. Mr. President, today the international community is witnessing a veritable carnage against the Palestinian people, and although we regret to admit it, the body entrusted by the Charter of the UN with ensuring the maintenance of international peace and security has been prevented by some of its members from fully and effectively exercising its duties. As a result of that, it has not been able to adopt a much-needed resolution unequivocally demanding a ceasefire. As we've heard this morning in this room, Mr. President, the time to act has now come. Every minute lost has an impact on the lives of hundreds of thousands of people on the ground. And therefore, we reiterate our demand for an immediate ceasefire and an end to the ongoing atrocities. Not only is this necessary in the name of humanity, as recently stressed by the Secretary General, but also for ensuring that humanitarian assistance can enter the Gaza Strip so that it can be rapidly distributed to all those in desperate need today. The recently adopted resolution by the Security Council, while we welcome that resolution, we believe that it falls short and is not commensurate with the catastrophic situation today on the ground. This body must adopt strong measures under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter in order to demand that expressly demand that Israeli immediately cease its attacks against the Palestinian people throughout the entire occupied Palestinian territory, including in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, finally, we stress once again that a lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can only be achieved by peaceful means, and we call for urgent efforts to address the root causes of this protracted and tragic conflict, which has years of occupation and its subsequent consequences at its core. Today, as never before, we must create a credible political future which will lead to the achievement of the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination through the establishment of a free, independent, and sovereign state of Palestine within pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela for its cooperation, and I now invite the representative of the European Union to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. And I want to really appreciate you, President, for calling this a highly important briefing this morning. And I want to extend a word of thanks and admiration for the work of the UN and say to the briefers today and to all their staff that we've heard them about their concerns and we have heard them as to their priorities. I speak on behalf of the EU and its member states, and I want to say that we really share the deep concerns that we've heard today about the devastating humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The situation for civilians is alarming, and we commend the Security Council for passing finally a resolution this week that specifically calls for international humanitarian law compliance by all parties, humanitarian pauses, and protection of civilians, especially children. This resolution has to be implemented. We offer our sincere condolences to families of Palestinians, Israelis, and UN staff who have been killed, injured, or held hostage during this time. And we deplore the killing of humanitarian and medical personnel, including, at the latest count, 102 UNRWA officials. The European Union reiterates our condemnation in the strongest possible terms of Hamas for its indiscriminate terrorist attacks across Israel, and we reiterate our call on Hamas to immediately release all hostages without any preconditions. We re-emphasize Israel's right to defend itself in line with international law and international humanitarian law. We are ready to contribute to reviving a political process on the basis of the two-state solution, including through the Peace Day effort, and welcome other diplomatic peace and security initiatives, and we support the holding of an international peace conference soon. We reiterate the importance of ensuring the protection of all civilians at all times in line with international humanitarian law. We condemn the use of hospitals and civilians as human shields by Hamas. Civilians must be allowed to leave the combat zone. These hostilities are severely impacting hospitals and taking a horrific toll on civilians and medical staff, as we've heard today. We emphasize that international humanitarian law stipulates that hospitals, medical supplies, and civilians inside hospitals must be protected. Hospitals must also be supplied immediately with the most urgent medical supplies, and patients that require urgent medical care need to be evacuated safely. In this context, we urge Israel to exercise maximum restraint to ensure the protection of all civilians. The fundamental principles of international humanitarian law of distinction, proportionality, and precaution must be complied with in all military action. Humanitarian and medical workers must be able to do their work, which is to deliver life-saving assistance. As winter approaches, humanitarian access at the appropriate scale to meet humanitarian need is even more urgent. Humanitarian law requires parties to allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded access for humanitarian aid for civilians in need. In this regard, we welcome the results of the 9th November humanitarian conference held in Paris. All parties must also ensure the safety and security of humanitarian and medical staff and cooperate with the UN, International Red Cross, and Red Crescent movement and humanitarian partners to ensure the timely delivery of relief supplies to civilians wherever they are. And as we've heard this morning, more needs to be done. We have called for unhindered humanitarian access and aid to reach those in need through all necessary measures. And we repeat our call for immediate pauses in hostilities and establishment of humanitarian corridors, including through increased capacity at border crossings and through a dedicated maritime route, so that humanitarian aid can safely reach the population in Gaza. We also call for rapid, safe, sustained, and unhindered humanitarian access into and within Gaza, and we urge the parties to cooperate with the UN, International Red Cross, and Red Crescent movement, and humanitarian partners in this regard. We call for parties to allow and facilitate access by the ICRC to hostages, as this is an essential part of their mandate as an independent, neutral organization dedicated to ensuring humanitarian protection and assistance for victims of armed conflict. The UN and its member states will continue to work closely with the international partners, the UN and other agencies, as well as countries in the region, to provide a sustained flow of assistance and facilitate access to food, water, medical care, fuel, and shelter, ensuring that it only reaches civilians in need. Talk is not enough, as Dr. Tedros said earlier today. The European Union has again increased our aid to Gaza, bringing the total to over 100 million euros for this year. EU member states have also significantly increased their assistance. We launched an EU humanitarian air bridge operation with several flights to Egypt to bring life-saving supplies to humanitarian organizations on the ground. As a long-standing humanitarian donor, we will continue to cooperate closely with the UN and humanitarian partners in the region in line with the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. I thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the European Union, and I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark, speaking on behalf of the Nordic countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am taking the floor on behalf of the Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. We have listened with great concern to the briefings by UN agencies here today. We want to thank you for your efforts and hard work under extremely difficult circumstances. The Nordic countries reiterate our strong condemnation of Hamas terrorist attacks. We re-emphasize Israel's right to defend itself in line with international humanitarian law. We are extremely concerned about the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and its grave impact on the civilian population. More than an estimated 11,000 civilians have been killed. Almost half of them are children. This is unacceptable, and the situation is getting worse by the hour. Allow me to reiterate the urgent need for full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to and throughout Gaza to ensure that aid reaches all those in need. We have no time to lose. We welcome the fact that trucks with humanitarian aid are now entering Gaza on a daily basis through the Rafah crossing, but much more help is needed to meet the dire needs. More humanitarian aid must reach the civilian population of Gaza, who are desperately in need of food, water, shelter, electricity, and medical care, and this must happen now. Fuel is an absolute necessity for the aid to reach the people in need throughout Gaza. And we need to urgently establish extended humanitarian pauses and corridors throughout the Gaza Strip as an incremental step to ensure that emergency aid can arrive and that civilians, medical personnel, and humanitarian workers can seek protection. Allow me to further emphasize the requirement to protect civilians at all times in line with international humanitarian law. Respecting international humanitarian law encompasses the protection of civilian infrastructure, schools, and hospitals. Medical personnel and humanitarian relief personnel must be protected by all parties to the conflict, and the fundamental international humanitarian law principles must be complied with in all military action. Hospitals must not be used to shield military objectives from attack. The situation again highlights that the only sustainable way to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a negotiated two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders. We as the international community must bear our responsibility by making the strongest possible push for negotiations as soon as it becomes possible. Let me conclude by conveying our deepest gratitude to the UN and other humanitarian actors for their tireless efforts to ensure the urgent delivery of life-saving humanitarian aid to the civilian population in Gaza. We commend the humanitarian personnel working day and night in Gaza under extreme conditions to facilitate the urgent delivery of humanitarian assistance. And this heroic work has currently cost at least 102 UN personnel their lives. We reiterate that humanitarian workers and UN personnel must be protected at all times. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the representative of Denmark for his statement, and I now offer the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, allow me at the beginning to thank you so much for listening to the suggestions from the Arab Group and the Organization of Islamic Conference when we met about a week ago in order to continue on the path of the decisive decision adopted in the 10th Emergency Special Session about 3 weeks ago by not continuing the debate and the discussions and the divisions and the differences of opinions, but also to bring in those who are experts in the field of providing humanitarian organizations and to listen to what they have to say to all of us with a view that those who are still fixated on political discourse without paying sufficient attention to the tragedy unfolding upon the Palestinian people to hopefully listen to them and agree to what they are saying and more importantly, to implement what they are calling for. To listen is good, but to implement what they are telling us to do is even better. All of them, led by the Secretary General of the United Nations, are saying after 40 days now, we need a humanitarian ceasefire now, as you said yourself, Mr. President. We need, in this presence of a massive participation of all membership of the United Nations at the level of ambassadors, which we appreciate because all of you think the situation is so dangerous, so important, we need to act. We don't need to keep repeating arguments about analysis and to allow Israel to continue the war and in the same time to continue pushing for humanitarian assistance. It doesn't work that way. You need to stop this war. We need a humanitarian ceasefire now, as all of the humanitarian representatives told us, and many more who did not brief us are on the same page. After 40 days, we cannot have a humanitarian ceasefire. How many more of Palestinian children you want to see being killed, and women and civilians and sick and wounded, before you come to the conclusion of implementing what you are listening to them from all the agencies who are working in the humanitarian field? I think that this meeting, the purpose of this meeting, is to move an additional step in the direction of implementing the General Assembly resolution and also implementing the Security Council resolution, and to implement an immediate ceasefire, humanitarian ceasefire. Now, call it what you want to call it, but let us save lives. Let us stop this carnage. Human life is sacred. All of human life is sacred, particularly the children, all the children. Let us act. Let us not keep repeating ourselves. The day is a day of acting. Acting, it means stop this war, and then we can talk about all the other issues. And also I want to conclude, Mr. Chairman, by associating myself with the statement of my brother, the ambassador of Libya, on behalf of the Arab group, and the ambassador of Mauritania of the OIC on behalf of the OIC group. I thank you again very much for convening this meeting. I hope that this meeting is a very important step in the direction of seeing action and implementation. And I know that millions of people are watching us, and they want action. They don't want us to keep repeating the same argument from day one. They need to see that this horror stories, this onslaught and attacks against our people in the Gaza Strip to stop, and to stop immediately, and to provide the people with all of the necessities of living and sustaining their lives, and to stop the crime against humanity of forced transfer of the Palestinian people outside our homeland. One Nakba is enough. We don't need another Nakba. And I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the suffering in Gaza is the result of Hamas's decision to declare war upon Israel on October 7th. On that day, thousands of terrorists invaded our country, our homes, murdered, burned, raped, mutilated, everything they encountered, innocent civilians, women, children, and the elderly. Mr. President, none of us wants to be in the situation we are in today. This is not a war that Israel started. It is not a war that we wanted. It is a war that Hamas declared on us with the October 7th massacre. Since Israel is operating to topple Hamas rule, destroy its military capabilities, and eliminate the threat posed to its citizens in the Gaza Strip. In accordance with international law, the IDF warned the residents of the Gaza Strip and called on them to move temporarily south. Israel is also permitting the passage of humanitarian supplies for the civilian population in the southern Gaza Strip, despite indication that Hamas is appropriating some of the aid. So far, hundreds of aid trucks have entered the Strip and dozens more enter daily. Hamas, on the other hand, acts to prevent civilians from moving south, including by attacking safe routes. Hamas exploits the civilians of Gaza, firing rockets indiscriminately from within dense urban areas. Hamas has a strategy, embeds armaments and terrorist cells within, next to, and underneath hospitals, as well as schools, mosques, UN facilities, and other concentrations of civilians. This practice constitutes war crime. One point has to be clear. Hamas makes extensive use of hospitals, medical institutions, and ambulances for military purposes. Evidence from the past few days clearly validate that Hamas is hiding weapons and military gear inside its hospitals and builds tunnels, endangering the lives of every patient or medical staff. With regards to the calls for a ceasefire, as long as there are 238 people held by Hamas, there is no place for extended ceasefire. Israel acts to depose the Hamas regime, destroy its military capabilities, and remove the terrorist threat posed to Israel from the Gaza Strip. And we will make every effort to bring our hostages back home. Mr. President, my country urges the international community to condemn the terrorist attack on its citizens and to express clear recognition of Israel's full right to defend itself and to support it until its goals are achieved. Thank you.
I should like to thank the representative of Israel for his statement, and I now offer the floor to the representative of Egypt.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, Ambassador Dennis Francis. I wish to extend our gratitude to you, Mr. President, for convening this very important briefing. Full appreciation to all the distinguished briefers, not only for the comprehensive briefings, but also for the heroic role performed by the UN agencies in Gaza. To describe the humanitarian situation in Gaza today as catastrophic would be a gross understatement. Thousands of civilians have been killed by indiscriminate Israeli military action and Israeli attacks on hospitals, schools, and UN personnel continue unabated. While the civilized world calls for a ceasefire, Israel is regrettably indifferent to these calls and continues to its criminal aggression against the people of Gaza. Israel, and unfortunately a small minority of states, continue to advance the baseless claims that this aggression is in self-defense or the even more ludicrous claim that the Palestinian civilians are somehow to be blamed for their current plight. Egypt unequivocally rejects these claims and continues to call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, as well as for full and unfettered humanitarian access to all areas of Gaza. Never before have two issues, a complete ceasefire and full humanitarian access, been so closely intertwined. Our humanitarian objectives simply cannot be realized under a torrent of bombs, shells, and bullets. We welcome the Security Council that the Security Council has finally pronounced itself on the current situation, having adopted Resolution 2712, which calls for urgent and extended humanitarian pauses. This resolution is the first step towards a complete and sustained ceasefire. But without implementation by Israel, it will be added to a very long list of Security Council resolutions that have been ignored by Israel. It is the Security Council's sole responsibility now to ensure that resolution 2712 is immediately implemented. Further, it seems to us that the pressing need for a durable ceasefire should have been crystal clear, especially to delegations that have regularly positioned themselves as the sole champions of human rights and international humanitarian law, and what they describe as a rules-based international order. This is being put to a test, let's see. However, it is becoming increasingly apparent to us that this appear to be there are two sets of rules, or perhaps even two different realities, one that is being applied selectively in certain situations and one in others. While there are some budding indications of a shift in the positions of some, no doubt this is due to the actions of this August Assembly. This is still clearly not enough. Egypt shall continue to exert all possible effort to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza. As we speak, 75% of the aid that has reached Gaza is donated by Egypt. 9,000 tons out of 12,000 tons, Mr. President. We are sharing the bread with our brothers and sisters in Gaza. We reiterate once again that the Rafah crossing has remained open from the Egyptian side. By contrast, Israel, the occupying power, continues to place undue restrictive measures on the flow of life-saving assistance at a time when infants in Gaza are dying in incubators, while others are pleading for a drink of water. Israel also insists on keeping other crossings under its direct control firmly closed, a fact that little attention is paid to. This is all part of the strategy being relentlessly pursued by Israel and designed to exacerbate even further the unbearable conditions borne by the Palestinians, leading to their forcible displacement to neighboring countries. This cynical and criminal strategy will fail, Mr. President, and should never be tolerated. This is a collective responsibility of the international community. Furthermore, Egypt pledges to continue working closely with the UN and other humanitarian partners to deliver assistance to Gaza. In that regard, a UN technical team is on the ground in Egypt and working closely with local authorities and civil society. Also in that regard, tribute has to be paid to the enduring efforts of the Egyptian Red Crescent, an organization that has been instrumental in delivering the 9,000 tons to our brothers in Gaza. In conclusion, Mr. President, it has to be stated that it is in these difficult times that are a genuine compass of true moral fiber, and of which side of history will member states choose to stand. Will the murderous war machine be forced to halt its crimes? Will the children of Gaza be saved, or will the crimes continue and hate emerge victorious? History, Mr. President, is a just but harsh judge. Let's save the Palestinians. Let's save Palestine. Let's save Israel from itself. I submit, distinguished President.
I should like to thank the representative of Egypt for his statement, and I now invite the representative of the United Kingdom to take the floor.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to start by thanking the United Nations, particularly today's briefers and all the humanitarians for their truly heroic efforts. And I extend again my condolences to the UN family and the families of those 103 staff members in Gaza who have lost their lives in the last 6 weeks. President, as I said in the Security Council on Wednesday, it is impossible to comprehend the pain and the loss that civilians are enduring in this conflict. Too many civilians are losing their lives. And the protection of civilians and alleviating suffering is the top priority for the UK. That is why we strongly welcomed the passage of the Security Council's humanitarian resolution this week. This calls for a humanitarian pause for a period of days, for long enough to get life-saving aid to those who need it. This will establish a safer environment for humanitarians and support urgent efforts to secure the immediate and safe release of all hostages. We must now turn these words into action. The UK is committed to the urgent implementation of this resolution, in particular in 3 areas. First, we are working with our partners to provide and to get life-saving items into Gaza. This includes food, water, medical supplies, and crucially, fuel. The priority must be for Israel to allow sufficient fuel into Gaza so that humanitarian operations can run unimpeded and so hospitals and desalination plants can operate. Secondly, we are supporting efforts to scale up the response. We are urging, and I urge again here today, that the priority must be improved land access, including at Kerem Shalom, as well as scaled up access at Rafah, so aid can reach the levels needed. Thirdly, we remain clear that both sides must comply with international humanitarian law and take every possible step to minimize harm to civilians. That includes respecting the sanctity of hospitals so that healthcare professionals can care for the sick and the injured. President, a humanitarian response to this crisis is vital, but our responsibility does not end there. We will redouble our efforts with our partners to create a new political horizon to deliver on the promise of peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians and make the two-state solution a reality. I thank you.
I should like to thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now invite the representative of Tunisia to take the floor.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, my delegation would like to thank you for holding this session, and we express our appreciation to the briefers for their statements, which uncovered once again the atrocious crimes and the genocide perpetrated by the occupation in the Gaza Strip. It has shown the human inferno faced by civilians in Gaza. The systemic killing of children, women, and families, the targeting of hospitals, schools, places of worship, UN facilities, humanitarian workers, and journalists. These attacks have reached unprecedented levels. They continue to escalate in a blatant violation of international humanitarian law, despite the appalling number of those killed and injured and the scale of devastation, and despite the many decisions and resolutions issued and adopted by the UN, we strongly condemn the war crimes and massacres perpetrated by the occupying force against Palestinian civilians. They're using hunger, cutting off basic services, water, electricity, the destruction of hospitals as a tool of war, as a collective punishment. As the international community remains silent, we call on the international community and the Security Council to hold accountable the occupying power for all these crimes so that it puts an end to its aggressive practices and its plans for forced transfer. We also call on international protection for the Palestinian people and immediate access to humanitarian assistance and medical assistance in a sufficient manner without any preconditions from the occupying force. I wonder what prevents the international community from doing so. How many innocent lives should we lose? We have lost over 11,000 innocent individuals for us to act. We are today at a milestone where we are witnessing a genocide, a forced transfer of the people of Gaza, the largest since 1948. They are adopting measures of closure, of collective punishment, blatantly disregarding international and legal instruments. We do appreciate the positions of the Secretary General and the efforts of humanitarian and UN agencies. However, the international community should shoulder its moral and legal responsibility and put an end to this humanitarian tragedy to preserve the credibility and effectiveness of international law and international humanitarian law and all our human values. Thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the representative of Tunisia for his statement, and I now invite the representative of the United States to take the floor. Ma'am.
Thank you, President Francis, Ambassador Ossani, Ambassador Lagda, for convening us today. And thank you to the humanitarian briefers here today, who are at the forefront of the response effort and are helping ensure that aid gets to those who need it quickly, safely, and continuously. Let me start by saying something that should be obvious to all of us. Hamas's actions on October 7th were barbaric acts of terror and set into motion what we are witnessing today. And Hamas bears responsibility for causing so much senseless suffering on all sides. This moment calls on all of us to empathize with the plight of Israelis and Palestinians, to put ourselves in their shoes and see the world through their eyes, to recognize that the suffering of one people does not invalidate the suffering of another, and that just as there is no limit to pain, there's no limit to the compassion we can extend to all those experiencing it. That spirit, that drive toward collective understanding that is at the foundation of the United Nations, and it is at the core of the resolution adopted this week by the Security Council. I'm grateful to Malta and other members of the Council that work constructively on this product. Now this resolution does have real shortcomings. It failed to condemn Hamas's terrorism, as the General Assembly also failed to do so, and it failed to reaffirm the right and indeed the responsibility of Israel to protect its citizens from terrorism. But I want to be clear, the United States supports many of the critical provisions that the Council did adopt, including the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages held by Hamas and other groups, and humanitarian pauses to help enable full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to civilians in Gaza. Colleagues, we've made some progress, but we need to urgently scale up the flow of food, water, and medicine. Just yesterday, the first of 5 U.S. chartered planes landed in Al Arish, carrying 49 tons of nutritious, ready-to-eat food. But fuel is critically needed to get supplies into the hands of those who need them. Make no mistake, this is a matter of utmost urgency. For our part, the United States will work with the UN, Israel, other donors, regional partners to enable humanitarian workers to do the work so desperately needed to save civilians. This moment has made it abundantly clear we need a strong and effective UN and a strong and effective UNRWA. We need to take this moment to commend the workers, including UNRWA staff, on the ground in Gaza. Without the brave men and women who work for UNRWA, it would be impossible to get aid into vulnerable communities. The 103 UNRWA staff and their families who died, we mourn their loss and the loss of many of their loved ones, and we commit to honoring their legacy. We also continue to support humanitarian pauses with sufficient advance notification so that vulnerable people can use them to move out of harm's way. And we again call for those pauses to be coordinated with the UN to maximize aid reaching people in need. On that note, we believe Assistance should be based on need, not location, and provided consistent with humanitarian principles. So we're working with humanitarian partners on alternatives that will allow safe and increased delivery of life-saving assistance to those who need it most. Underlying this concept is our firm belief that all parties to the conflict must respect and protect UN facilities, medical personnel, and facilities and civilian objects in accordance with international law. That also means respecting and protecting hospitals. You all know Hamas has deeply embedded itself within the civilian population, including at hospitals. This is appalling and atrocious, but Hamas's actions do not lessen Israel's responsibility to protect civilians. In fact, as a democracy, Israel has an added responsibility given the way Hamas operates. The United States has been clear on this, and I will say again, we do not want to see patients, the people who take care of them, are hostages caught in the crossfire. For that reason, we also support improved humanitarian notification and deconfliction procedures. These are vital to minimizing the loss of civilian life and can reduce the possibility of tragic incidents like what occurred this week near a field hospital. Colleagues, it's impossible to look at the haunting images, to hear the devastating stories coming out of this crisis and not feel deeply. Every civilian death is a tragedy, every single one. But our anger, our sadness, our raw empathy, it cannot drive us to look the other way. Let us all do our part to address this humanitarian crisis. Let us all recognize the shared humanity of both Israelis and Palestinians, and let us all work toward a future in which they can live side by side in states of their own with peace, freedom, and security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the representative of the United States for his statement, and I now offer the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Mr. President, thank you for organizing this meeting. I also thank the briefers for their valuable insights. I would first like to express our deep appreciation to the UN agencies, their staff working selflessly on the ground in order to extend a helping hand to those in need. I pay tribute to the memory of more than 100 brave UN personnel who have made the ultimate sacrifice in this honorable mission. May God bless their souls. When the Joint Arab-Islamic Extraordinary Summit was held in Riyadh, our leaders strongly condemned Israeli aggression in Gaza and called for an immediate ceasefire, as well as an end to practices of siege, collective punishment, and forced displacement of people, while emphasizing the importance of unhindered, sustainable humanitarian access. I join previous speakers in reiterating these common positions. Mr. President, death, displacement, trauma, fear, and anxiety have taken on unprecedented dimensions in Gaza over the last 6 weeks. Mankind has not seen such human tragedy in recent history. Neither civilians nor civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, refugee camps, are being spared in indiscriminate bombing. International human rights law and international humanitarian law are being trampled underfoot on a daily basis. We cannot stay silent while this carnage continues to unfold before our eyes. Priority must be given to the urgent humanitarian needs of the civilian population. They must have access to the essentials for survival, including food, water, fuel, shelter, hygiene, health, and safety. Mr. President, Turkey has been trying to deliver humanitarian assistance to Gaza since the start of the conflict. We keep sending humanitarian aid to Egypt's El Arish airport. The Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital in Gaza is unfortunately among many hospitals that had to stop its operations under heavy Israeli bombardment. We have transferred cancer patients at this hospital to Turkey to continue their treatments. Once again, I would like to thank Brotherly Egypt for their tireless humanitarian efforts and cooperation. Mr. President, we welcome the adoption of the resolution on protection of children on the Security Council on Wednesday. However, the continued failure of the Security Council to stop the catastrophic tragedy in Gaza is inexcusable. Surely history will judge both the perpetrators and those who failed to take concrete action. Mr. President, what has transpired has once again showed that lasting peace and security in the Middle East can only be achieved through a political solution to the Palestinian question based on a two-state vision. I thank you.
I should like to thank the representative of Turkey for his statement, and I now invite who would be the last speaker on our list today, that is, the representative of the State of Qatar, to take the floor, but to permit me to say that I have decided, in light of the length of the list of speakers remaining on our list, I have decided that we will reconvene this informal plenary, the timing of which would be a matter of consultation between myself and the Secretariat. Delegations would be advised accordingly on a timely basis. Can I invite the representative of the State of Qatar?
شكرا لكم السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, we would like to thank you for responding to the request of the Arab Group and the OIC for holding this meeting. We align ourselves with the statements of both groups. We also thank the briefers for illustrating what is happening on the ground in the Gaza Strip. Civilians in the Gaza Strip are suffering from a humanitarian catastrophe as a result of the brutal Israeli bombardment. They've been deprived of basic living components. Over two-thirds are displaced, while over 40,000 people are either dead, injured, or missing under the rubble, including staff from the UN and humanitarian agencies. This violence is impacting children and women disproportionately, as they are 70% of the victims. The Gaza Strip has been described as the graveyard for children. A joint statement issued yesterday from the Special Rapporteurs of Human Rights in Geneva have said that the situation in the Gaza Strip is at a grave risk of genocide. Many journalists have lost their lives. We would like to condemn any violations perpetrated by Israel in blatant violation of international law and international humanitarian law. Furthermore, the recent raiding by the IDF of Al-Shifa Hospital, this is a war crime and a blatant violation of international laws and conventions, especially the Fourth Geneva Convention. The State of Qatar stresses that this policy of collective punishment is dangerous, including attempts for the forced transfer of the Palestinian people. We are concerned of the ongoing Israeli ground operations which has had a destructive impact on the safety of civilians. We call for the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2712 and the resolution issued by the GA number 21 from the emergency session. We also call for an immediate ceasefire and for the protection of civilians, as well as the access of humanitarian assistance in an immediate manner. Mr. President, the State of Qatar has provided humanitarian support to Gaza in coordination with the UN to improve the living conditions in the Strip as a result of the ongoing blockade, to alleviate the suffering of citizens there. The State of Qatar will continue to provide assistance despite the bombardment by the Israeli occupying force of the Qatari headquarters for the reconstruction of Gaza. This crime is a blatant violation of international law. As this center is concerned with humanitarian work, Qatar will continue with its diplomatic efforts, which we have started since the beginning of this crisis, in order to make progress in de-escalation so that we can reach a ceasefire and to guarantee the release of all detainees, especially civilians. I thank you.
I should like to thank the representative of the State of Qatar. This brings us to the end of our list. Allow me to express on your behalf and on my own behalf our appreciation to the interpreters for facilitating the extension of our work. The Office of the President will advise in due course as to the date and time of the reconvening of the session. We are in adjournment.
This shipment from one of UNHCR's biggest global stockpiles includes shelter material, solar lamps, blankets, kitchen sets, and other emergency items, carrying 53 metric tons of supplies to help the survivors of Libya's deadly floods. This wouldn't be possible without the generosity of our donors and partners. Please continue supporting survivors in Libya and vulnerable people around the world.
I just got back from the Benina airport in Benghazi. I was there with my colleagues to receive an airlift carrying 53 metric tons of emergency humanitarian relief sent by one of UNHCR's stockpiles in Dubai. This shipment contains kitchen sets, solar lamps, blankets, plastic sheets, and other emergency relief items that will be distributed by UNHCR through our local partners to thousands of people who have been affected by the floods that hit the eastern parts of Libya last Sunday. While we continue to respond to the most immediate and urgent needs, a lot more needs to be done in the coming weeks and months to help people cope with the devastation caused by the flood. These women, men, and children need all the support that they can get to rebuild their lives. My name is Rana Kseifi. I'm heading the UNHCR Libya Protection Team. I'm here on the ground in Derna with my colleagues. Derna is one of the cities that has been affected the most by Storm Daniel, which hit last Sunday the eastern parts of Libya. As you can see from the surroundings behind me, the situation is horrific. I cannot explain what I saw on the way coming to Derna. I saw roads split in half. I saw massive rocks that have been moved over from neighboring mountains to the coastal areas. Homes have been demolished, damaged, submerged underwater. Families have lost a very big number of their loved ones. Many are still missing, some have been split, and others have been displaced. The search and rescue teams continue to try to save lives, but the situation is far from being stable at the moment. UNHCR has already provided core relief items as a first and immediate response, and we're working with our local partners to provide a lot more to try to mitigate the impact on those families who continue to suffer tremendous amount of shock. But the needs are huge, and a lot more support is needed and urgent.